Margaret Walker had lived in Silver Pines for over 30 years, watching the neighborhood change from a quiet, close-knit community to a place ruled by iron-fisted bureaucracy. But nothing could have prepared her for Veronica Blake, the new HOA president with a ruthless vendetta against elderly residents. Ever since she took over, Veronica had made it clear. Silver Pines needed fresh energy, and that meant getting rid of the old and disabled. At first, it was subtle. Passive-aggressive letters about neighborhood aesthetics, sudden new rules against front porch seating, and a ridiculously high fine for leaving her bins out 5 minutes past collection time. But then, the attacks became personal. Margaret's wheelchair ramp, her only way in and out of her home, was suddenly deemed an unauthorized structure. Never mind the fact that she had all the proper council permits, Veronica had decided it was an eyesore that dragged down property values. Then came the violations. 1, 2, 5 in a month, each more absurd than the last. Margaret knew exactly what was happening. Veronica wanted to bully her out of her home, and Margaret wasn't having it. One chilly morning, she woke to the sound of hushed voices outside. 2 men in suits were measuring her ramp, and standing beside them, smug as ever, was Veronica, tapping away on her clipboard like she was signing Margaret's eviction papers. Something was coming, something big, and Margaret could feel it in her bones. The harassment escalates. Veronica's sinister plan unfolds. Margaret gripped the edge of her window frame, her knuckles turning white as she watched Veronica Blake whispering to the 2 men in suits. They scribbled notes, pointed at the ramp, and nodded like they were inspecting some kind of crime scene. A cold shiver ran down her spine. This wasn't just about a few petty HOA violations anymore. This was a setup. A full-blown operation. Margaret had seen enough so-called policy enforcements under Veronica's rule to know how this worked. First, the warnings. Then, the legal jargon-filled letters designed to confuse and intimidate. And finally, when the victim was too exhausted to fight, HOA swooped in like vultures, tearing down their homes, their lives, one manufactured rule at a time. But not this time. Not her. She yanked her phone from the table and started recording, zooming in on Veronica's smug expression. "Caught you," she muttered under her breath. If Veronica thought she could bulldoze her way over Margaret without a fight, she had another thing coming. Later that evening, an official-looking yellow envelope was taped to her door. Margaret didn't even need to open it to know what it was. Another violation. Another ridiculous fine. Another attempt to make her give up. But when she tore it open, her stomach twisted. This letter serves as final notice of removal, it read. Your unauthorized structure will be demolished by order of the Silver Pines Homeowners Association. Demolished. She read it again, her pulse pounding in her ears. There was a date at the bottom. Tomorrow morning. A sharp knock at the door made her jump. She opened it to find her neighbor, James, shifting uncomfortably on her porch. He was in his late 60s, a retired builder, and one of the few people left in Silver Pines who hadn't been scared into silence. "Margaret," he murmured, glancing around as if checking for Veronica's spies. "I overheard something at the clubhouse. They're bringing in a crew. A bulldozer. A bulldozer." Her breath caught. They were actually going to destroy her ramp. James hesitated before lowering his voice. "I also heard they might be paying off the local council to look the other way." And there it was, the missing piece of the puzzle. Margaret's hands curled into fists. She wasn't just fighting HOA bureaucracy. She was fighting corruption. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every elderly resident who'd been bullied, every homeowner forced out of their house, every person who'd been steamrolled by Veronica's unchecked power. Margaret reached for her phone and did the only thing she could. She went live. Her face filled the screen, eyes sharp, voice steady. "Listen up, everyone. My name is Margaret Walker, and in less than 12 hours, a corrupt HOA is planning to bulldoze my wheelchair ramp, my only way in and out of my home. They think I'll just roll over and take it." She leaned in, her voice dropping to a steely whisper. But they have no idea who they're dealing with. What happens next will shock you. Stay tuned for part 3. If you believe Margaret deserves justice, comment "fight" below. And if you've ever had a nightmare HOA story, tell us in the comments. We'll expose them together. Like and subscribe if you're ready to see HOA corruption finally taken down. Alert. The morning air was crisp, but Margaret Walker felt nothing but rage boiling beneath her skin. She sat by the window, her hands wrapped around a cup of untouched tea, watching the street outside like a hawk. Any moment now. Then she heard it. A low, mechanical growl echoed through Silver Pines. The ground trembled. Birds scattered from the trees. Margaret's heart slammed against her ribs as she wheeled herself forward, peering through the curtains. And there it was. A massive yellow bulldozer rumbled down the road, flanked by two white HOA utility trucks. Behind them, a handful of men in orange vests, contractors, no doubt hired under the table, moved with cold efficiency, setting up traffic cones and measuring tape around her driveway. And at the center of it all, dressed in an impeccable cream blazer and smug satisfaction, stood Veronica Blake. Margaret felt a sharp, burning fury rise in her chest. She wheeled to the door and threw it open. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Her voice, strong despite her age, cut through the morning silence. Veronica turned, her expression delightfully cruel, as if she had been waiting for this moment. "Oh, good, you're up," she said, feigning surprise. "I was afraid you'd sleep through the whole thing." Margaret's eyes darted to the bulldozer, its massive steel blade hovering just feet from her ramp. "You can't do this," she hissed. "That ramp is legal. I have the permits." Veronica's smile widened like a shark's. Not according to the Silver Pines HOA. She reached into her handbag, producing a stack of documents. "You were notified. This structure is non-compliant, unsafe, an eyesore." Margaret's stomach tightened. She already knew what the papers would say: lies, half-truths, technicalities twisted to justify this attack. She didn't need to read them. "What you're doing is illegal," she snapped. "This is discrimination." Veronica clicked her tongue. "Oh, Margaret, don't be so dramatic." She turned, giving the bulldozer operator a curt nod. "Proceed." The engine roared to life. "No!" Margaret's voice shook with fury, but nobody listened. The blade descended, slamming into the edge of the concrete ramp. A sickening crack rang through the air as a chunk of it crumbled away. Margaret's hands dug into the wheels of her chair. She wanted to stop it, to throw herself in front of the machine if she had to, but she was trapped, powerless, forced to watch as weeks of careful construction, her only link to independence, was ripped apart before her eyes. Crash. Another piece broke loose, tumbling onto the driveway in a cloud of dust. Across the street, curtains twitched. Neighbors peeked through their windows, but nobody dared step outside. Except for one. James. He emerged from his house, fists clenched, face dark with anger. He wasn't alone. A handful of other residents followed, drawn out by the commotion. Their expressions ranged from shock to outrage. "Veronica, stop this," James called. "This isn't right." Veronica turned, unfazed. "This is HOA business," she said smoothly. "Go back inside." But they didn't move. Margaret saw it then, the first crack in Veronica's confidence. The crowd was growing, and she wasn't the only one watching anymore. The dark truth behind HOA, a battle bigger than Margaret. The destruction of the ramp wasn't just an act of petty vengeance. It was a message, a warning. This is what happens when you defy Veronica Blake. But Margaret wasn't just going to sit there and take it. As the dust settled over the shattered remains of her ramp, she pulled out her phone, her hands shaking with controlled fury, and started recording. "Look at this," she said, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. A corrupt HOA, a crooked president, and an entire neighborhood too scared to fight back. She zoomed in on Veronica, who had the nerve to smile for the camera. "This is Margaret Walker, and if you think this is just about me, think again." She turned the camera towards the crowd. Neighbors stood frozen, some clutching their phones, some whispering among themselves. But no one stepped forward. No one challenged Veronica. That was about to change. Margaret cut the live feed and turned to James. "I need you to help me dig." James frowned. "Dig what?" "The truth." Over the next few hours, Margaret and James worked tirelessly. They scoured old HOA records, tracked every violation notice Veronica had ever sent, and reached out to former residents who had mysteriously disappeared from Silver Pines. And what they found made Margaret's blood run cold. Veronica wasn't just abusing her power, she was running a scheme. Suspicious evictions targeting elderly residents. Homes bought out at below-market prices by a private real estate firm. That same firm just happened to have connections to Veronica's personal bank account. It wasn't just corruption. It was theft, fraud, organized crime. Margaret leaned back in her chair, heart racing. She's not just trying to get rid of me. She's been flipping houses for profit. James whistled. She's making a fortune off people suffering. Margaret exhaled, steeling herself. Then let's make sure the whole world knows. This is where you come in. If you think Veronica has finally met her match, comment "expose her" below. And if you've ever dealt with HOA corruption, tell us your story. The more voices we have, the harder they fall. Stay tuned, because the next part will change everything. The fight for justice. A neighborhood awakens. Margaret barely slept that night. The rage that had simmered within her since the first violation notice was now a wildfire, consuming every ounce of exhaustion and doubt. She had proof, evidence that Veronica Blake wasn't just a cruel HOA dictator, but a fraudster running an elaborate scheme to force out elderly residents for profit. Morning arrived with a heavy stillness, the kind that settled before a storm. As Margaret wheeled herself onto her porch, she noticed something different. Neighbors were watching her. Some peeked through their curtains, others lingered by their mailboxes, whispering. The destruction of her ramp had shaken the community. They had seen what happened when someone stood up to Veronica. Now they had a choice: stay silent or fight back. James arrived first, carrying a thick folder of documents. He didn't bother with pleasantries. "I found something worse," he muttered, slapping the folder onto Margaret's lap. Veronica's been falsifying financial reports for the HOA. Money that's supposed to go to community projects? Gone. Redirected to private accounts. Margaret's stomach twisted as she flipped through the records. If this was true, Veronica wasn't just bullying residents, she was stealing from them. Then came the final nail in the coffin. A knock at the door. Margaret looked up to see a frail, elderly woman clutching an envelope to her chest. Mrs. Jenkins, one of the longest-standing residents of Silver Pines. Her voice trembled as she spoke. I got this yesterday," she said, holding out the paper with shaking hands. An eviction notice. Margaret's blood ran cold. "She's kicking you out?" James asked, voice tight with anger. Mrs. Jenkins nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I've lived here for 40 years. My late husband built this house. I have nowhere else to go." That was it. Margaret clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. This had gone far enough. Veronica Blake had built her empire on fear and silence. She had counted on people being too afraid to resist. But Margaret Walker wasn't afraid anymore. She turned to James, her voice like steel. "We go public. Today." James gave a slow nod. "I'll call the journalists." Margaret exhaled sharply and rolled back inside, preparing for war. She pulled out every document, every violation, every shred of proof that exposed Veronica's corruption. By midday, word had spread. Neighbors trickled in, hesitant at first, but then in larger numbers. They had stories of their own: unjust fines, intimidation tactics, strange fees deducted from their accounts. Veronica had terrorized this neighborhood for years. Not anymore. Margaret looked out over the gathering crowd, their anger growing, their fear fading. The battle for Silver Pines had begun, and this time, Veronica Blake was outnumbered. The showdown. Veronica falls into the trap. By the time Margaret rolled onto her porch, the front lawns of Silver Pines were packed. Neighbors stood shoulder to shoulder, a sea of angry, determined faces. Some clutched folders of their own, filled with unpaid invoices, fake violations, and decades of HOA corruption. Others held handwritten signs, scrawled with words like, "Enough is enough," and "Silver Pines belongs to the residents." And at the center of it all, standing tall in her signature cream blazer, was Veronica Blake. She had come alone without her usual entourage of HOA enforcers. That was her first mistake. Her second mistake? Thinking she was still in control. Well, Veronica sighed, surveying the crowd. This is quite the overreaction. Margaret didn't blink. You stole from this community, you bullied people out of their homes, and now we have proof. She lifted a thick folder of documents for the crowd to see. The damning evidence. Veronica barely glanced at it. She laughed. Oh, Margaret, she purred. Is this another one of your little tantrums? She turned to the crowd, her tone dripping with false concern. She's always been like this, you know. Difficult, resistant to change. A murmur spread through the crowd, but nobody laughed with her. Margaret wasn't rattled. She had prepared for this. You forged HOA financial records, she continued, voice steady. You've been funneling community funds into your own accounts. She lifted a second set of documents. You faked violations to push out elderly residents so you can sell their homes for profit. Veronica's jaw tightened. And worst of all, Margaret said, her voice rising, you destroyed my wheelchair ramp. You violated federal disability laws. The crowd erupted, not in chaos but in outrage, the kind of fury that couldn't be silenced anymore. Veronica lost her smile. Her hands curled into fists, but still, she held her ground. This is all nonsense, she snapped. You don't have any legal standing. This community operates under HOA regulations. Not anymore. A new voice cut through the air, sharp and commanding. The crowd parted, revealing a group of suited officials stepping onto the street. Margaret felt her heart pound as she recognized them. Government housing investigators, council representatives, and even a state lawyer. The cavalry had arrived. James smirked from beside her. Called in a few favors. Veronica stepped back, for the first time uncertain. Mrs. Blake, one of the investigators announced, unfolding a legal document in front of the crowd. We have sufficient evidence to open an official investigation into your handling of Silver Pines Homeowners Association. Margaret watched the color drain from Veronica's face. This was no longer just a neighborhood dispute. This was a legal battle she couldn't win. The air felt electric, like a storm was about to break. And Veronica Blake was right in the middle of it. The fall of Veronica Blake, justice strikes back. Veronica's confidence cracked like glass. The once composed, all-powerful HOA president was now pale, stiff, and visibly shaken as the state investigators stepped forward. Mrs. Blake, the lead investigator continued, his voice calm but firm, you are under official scrutiny for multiple counts of fraud, financial misconduct, and unlawful eviction practices. A hush fell over the crowd. Even the wind seemed to still as every resident of Silver Pines held their breath, watching the moment they had all been waiting for. Veronica forced a laugh, though it sounded hollow. Oh, come now, she scoffed, flipping her hair back, trying to regain control. This is ridiculous. Some exaggerated complaints from a handful of disgruntled pensioners? I have nothing to hide. But Margaret wasn't finished yet. She wheeled forward, meeting Veronica's narrowing eyes with unshakable resolve. Really? Then why don't we go over these bank statements? Margaret's hand hovered over the folder James had helped put together. The ones linking thousands of dollars in maintenance fees straight to your personal account? Veronica's jaw clenched. And what about these documents? James stepped up beside Margaret, holding up printouts of falsified HOA reports. The ones showing you approved home demolitions, without notifying the residents? Murmurs rippled through the crowd, anger and disbelief growing. Then, the final blow. A state official stepped forward. We've also been reviewing complaints from former residents of Silver Pines, he said. Turns out, you've done this before, to at least 4 other communities. Gasps rang out. A few neighbors swore under their breath. Veronica's face twisted. That's a blatant lie, Margaret smirked. Really? Because one of them just arrived. The crowd shifted, parting as a frail old man stepped forward, leaning on a cane. Mr. Lawson. Margaret recognized him from old community events, but he had vanished years ago. one of the many seniors Veronica had forced out under bogus violations. "I lived here for 15 years, Mr. Lawson's voice, though quiet, carried the weight of a man who had lost everything. "Until you stole my home. You raised my fees, made up fines I couldn't afford, then sold my house for half its value." His eyes, once tired, now burned with anger. "And you did it to dozens of us." The crowd erupted. Shouts of "thief" and "shame on you" filled the air. Veronica stepped back, her perfectly curated mask finally crumbling. Then came the final moment. A second investigator, a detective by the looks of him, walked forward, unfolding a warrant. "Mrs. Blake," he said smoothly, "you'll need to come with us." The crowd went silent. For the first time, Veronica looked truly afraid. Margaret didn't smile. Justice wasn't about revenge. It was about making sure no one else suffered under Veronica's greed again. And as they led the disgraced HOA president away, Margaret exhaled. Silver Pines was finally free. A new beginning. Silver Pines reclaims its freedom. As Veronica Blake was driven away in the back of a police car, Silver Pines stood still for a moment, almost as if the entire neighborhood was holding its breath, processing what had just happened. Then, as if a dam had broken, cheers erupted. Neighbors hugged, clapped, and even shed a few tears. The tyrant was gone. Margaret exhaled, her grip on her wheelchair's arms finally loosening. For the first time in months, she felt something that had become a stranger to her. Relief. James patted her shoulder. "Well, I'd say that went better than expected." Margaret gave a small, tired smile. "It's not over yet." And she was right. The battle against Veronica was won, but the war to fix Silver Pines was just beginning. The truth spreads like wildfire. That evening, the news trucks arrived, their cameras rolling as residents shared their horror stories of HOA abuse. But this time, there was no fear, only determination. Within hours, the footage of Veronica's arrest went viral. The hashtags #1, HOA corruption #1. Justice. For Silver Pines trended across social media. People from across the country shared their own HOA horror stories, exposing a much bigger problem. Then came the real shocker. State officials announced a full-scale investigation into corrupt HOA practices across the region. Silver Pines had sparked a movement. Silver Pines, reborn. With Veronica gone, the HOA board crumbled within days. The remaining members resigned in disgrace, and in their place, a new leadership committee was formed, one that actually cared about the residents. Their first order of business? Undoing Veronica's damage. All fraudulent HOA fines were revoked. Evictions were halted, and wrongfully displaced residents were invited back. The stolen funds? Recovered and reinvested into the community. And Margaret's wheelchair ramp? Not only was it rebuilt, but local artists painted it with a beautiful mural, turning it into a symbol of resilience. At night, it glowed softly with solar-powered lights, a beacon of change. The real cherry on top? The state government introduced a new Homeowners Protection Act, inspired by Silver Pine's battle against corruption. It would limit HOA power, enforce transparency, and protect vulnerable homeowners. Margaret smiled as she watched kids playing freely in the yards again, no longer fearing bogus violation notices. She had fought for justice, and won. What's next? But here's the thing. This isn't just Margaret's story, this could be your story too. Have you ever been bullied by an unfair HOA? Tell us in the comments. If you think Margaret's fight was legendary, comment "Justice served" below. Like and subscribe if you believe more people need to hear stories like this. And trust me, this is only the beginning. Eyes on fire.